The clock was ticking. Every second that passed brought her closer to the moment she had feared for years. The moment she would be forced onto a plane, taken away from the life she had built, ripped away from the only home she had known for decades. The fear in her eyes was real, the desperation in her voice, undeniable. But if there was one thing she had learned, it was that giving up was never an option. This is the story of a Black woman who refused to be silenced, who stood against a system that seemed determined to erase her existence. A woman who had done everything right, who had worked hard, paid taxes, contributed to her community, and built a life in a place she considered home, only to be told she didn't belong. And yet, against all odds, she fought back. Her name is Maya. She arrived in the United States as a teenager, full of hope, her mother's words echoing in her ears. "This is your chance. Make the most of it." And she did. She went to school, studied hard, and got a job as soon as she could. She sent money back home, helped raise her younger siblings, and eventually built a family of her own. America was her home. She had built a life here. But one day, everything changed. It started with a letter, a single piece of paper that carried the weight of a nightmare. Notice of removal. Just like that, decades of hard work, sacrifice, and dreams were reduced to a cold legal statement. You don't belong here. The system had found a loophole, a technicality in her immigration paperwork from years ago. And now they wanted to send her back to a country she barely remembered. Maya was stunned. How could this be happening? She had followed the rules. She had done everything she was supposed to do. She had paid her dues, raised her children, and never caused any trouble. And yet, here she was, facing deportation, facing the loss of everything she had worked for. But Maya wasn't just going to accept this. She wasn't going to walk away from her life without a fight. She hired lawyers, filed appeals, and gathered every piece of evidence she could to prove that she deserved to stay. She spoke to journalists, contacted community leaders, and even shared her story on social media, hoping someone, anyone, would listen. The more she fought, the harder the system pushed back. Court dates were delayed, documents went missing, and the legal fees piled up. At times, it felt like a cruel game, one designed to exhaust her until she had no choice but to give up. And there were moments when she almost did. Late at night, after another rejection, after another setback, she would sit in the darkness and wonder if it was all worth it. But then she would think of her children, her 2 sons, born and raised in the US, who had never known another home. What would happen to them if she was forced to leave? Who would fight for them if she wasn't there? That thought alone was enough to keep her going. Maya's story is not just about one woman's fight against deportation. It's about resilience. It's about the flaws in a system that so easily disregards the lives of those who have built their futures here. It's about the thousands of others like her who live in fear every day, wondering if the life they have built will be taken away from them in an instant. As the weeks turned into months, Maya's fight became bigger than just her case. People started paying attention. Her story gained traction. Activists rallied behind her. Communities came together, and the pressure on the system grew. But would it be enough? With her final court date approaching, Maya knew that everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for, would come down to this one last chance. If the judge ruled against her, she would be forced to leave within days. The thought sent chills down her spine. But there was no turning back now. As she stood outside the courtroom that morning, heart pounding, hands trembling, she took a deep breath. This was it. One last fight, one last chance to prove that she belonged. But would justice be on her side? Stay tuned to find out what happens next in Maya's battle to stay in the only home she has ever known. Her story isn't just about immigration. It's about courage, about standing up for what's right, and about never backing down, even when the odds are stacked against you. Maya sat in the courtroom, her hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She could hear the murmurs around her, the shuffle of papers, the low hum of voices preparing for yet another case. To the system, she was just another file, another name on a list, another person waiting for a decision. That could change everything. But to her, this was her life, her family, her entire world hanging in the balance. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Maya's lawyer, a woman named Sarah, who had taken on her case with fierce determination, stood beside her, whispering last-minute reassurances. But Maya wasn't sure anything could reassure her now. She had seen too many cases like hers. She had watched people walk into courtrooms with hope and leave in despair. She had seen the system fail too many times before. The prosecutor laid out the case, reading off cold technical details of why Maya was facing deportation, a small mistake in paperwork from years ago, a missed deadline, a bureaucratic error that had snowballed into a life-altering crisis. Maya wanted to scream that she had done everything right, that she had built a life here, that she was more than just numbers on a page. But she stayed silent, gripping the edge of the table as Sarah stood to speak. Sarah argued with passion, pointing out Maya's contributions to her community, her years of hard work, her children who relied on her. She brought up letters from Maya's employer, her church, her neighbors, people who vouched for her, who swore that she belonged here. But the judge's face remained unreadable, his expression giving nothing away. As the hearing went on, Maya's mind drifted back to the life she had built. She thought about the first time she set foot in this country, a nervous teenager, clutching her mother's hand, overwhelmed by the possibilities in front of her. She thought about the years of struggle, the job she had worked, the nights she had spent studying, determined to make something of herself. She thought about her two boys, who were sitting at home right now, waiting for her, not fully understanding how much was at stake. And then there was another thought, one that sent chills down her spine. What if she lost? What if, despite everything, the judge ruled against her? Maya had heard horror stories. She had seen what happened to others who were deported. Some had nowhere to go, no family waiting for them, no way to rebuild their lives. Some found themselves in dangerous situations, caught in countries they had left for a reason. She couldn't let that happen. She couldn't let her children be left behind, confused and scared, wondering where their mother had gone. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. The judge asked questions. Maya answered as best she could, her voice steady, despite the fear twisting in her stomach. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room on her, the pressure mounting with every passing second. Then came a moment that changed everything. The prosecutor, flipping through Maya's file, paused. His expression shifted slightly, and he whispered something to his colleague. Maya's heart pounded. Was this a good sign? A bad sign? Sarah caught on immediately. What is it? She asked, her voice sharp. The prosecutor hesitated before finally speaking. There's an issue with the paperwork, he admitted. It looks like there may have been an error on our end as well. Maya's breath caught in her throat. An error. On their end, Sarah pounced on the revelation. If there was a mistake in the way this case was handled, that changes everything. The judge frowned, flipping through the documents. The room held its breath. Maya could feel her pulse in her ears, her entire body tense. Was this it? Was this the moment that could turn things around? But then, just as quickly as hope had sparked, doubt crept in. Bureaucratic mistakes didn't always work in favor of people like Maya. The system wasn't built to admit fault so easily. The prosecutor's face hardened. "We'll need time to review this," he said. Time. Maya didn't have time. Every delay meant more uncertainty, more fear, more nights lying awake, wondering if tomorrow would be the day she lost everything. The judge sighed and leaned forward. "I will need to consider all factors before making a final decision," he said. His voice was calm, controlled. But to Maya, it was a thunderclap. Not today. No decision today. As court adjourned, Maya's legs felt weak beneath her. Sarah squeezed her arm. "This isn't over," she said firmly. "If they made a mistake, we can fight this. But we have to move fast." Maya nodded, but inside, she felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. The fight wasn't over, but neither was the fear. And now, with this new development, everything had become even more complicated. She stepped out of the courtroom into the cold air, her breath unsteady. People were waiting outside. Activists who had been following her case, friends who had stood by her, others who were fighting battles of their own. Someone asked her how she felt. She didn't know how to answer. Was she relieved? Was she terrified? Was she hopeful? As she looked around at the faces of those who believed in her, who were fighting alongside her, one thing became clear. She couldn't give up. No matter what happened next, she had to keep going. But the question still lingered in the air. Would the system finally listen? Or was this just another false hope before the inevitable? The answer was coming, but not yet. And Maya had no choice but to brace herself for what was still to come. Maya sat by the window that night, staring at the city lights outside, her mind racing. The courtroom battle had given her a glimmer of hope, but it had also left her suspended in uncertainty. The prosecutor's mistake could change everything, but it could also mean more delays, more waiting, more fighting. And Maya was tired. Tired of waking up every morning with the fear that today might be the day they forced her to leave. Tired of the endless cycle of appeals and court hearings, of watching her children carry the weight of her struggle. Her oldest son, Jordan, sat beside her. He was only 15, but the fight had aged him in ways she wished it hadn't. "We're gonna win, right?" he asked, his voice quiet. Maya hesitated. She wanted to tell him yes, to promise that everything would be okay. But she had learned long ago that nothing was certain. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I'm not giving up." The next few weeks felt like a test of her endurance. Sarah worked tirelessly, pushing for a resolution, using the prosecutor's mistake as leverage. The media picked up on the story, and Maya's case gained even more attention. Strangers reached out, offering support, signing petitions, making phone calls to lawmakers. It felt bigger than just her now, but the system didn't like to be challenged. New hurdles appeared out of nowhere. Requests for more paperwork, sudden changes in hearing dates, unexpected legal fees. It was exhausting, but Maya kept pushing forward. Then came the phone call that changed everything. Sarah's voice was steady, but there was something urgent in her tone. "Maya, I just got word. They're pushing for a decision. We have to be in court tomorrow." Maya's heart pounded. This was it. Everything was coming down to this one moment. The next morning, she walked into the courthouse with her head held high, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was packed. Supporters, reporters, people who had followed her journey. She saw Jordan sitting in the back, gripping his younger brother's hand. The judge entered, and the air felt thick with tension. This time, there was no long drawn-out legal argument. The prosecutor, perhaps realizing they had little ground to stand on, kept their statements brief. Sarah made one final plea, her voice strong, unwavering. Maya has built her life here. She is not a burden to this country. She is a part of it. Sending her away would not only be unjust, but it would break apart a family that belongs together. Maya held her breath as the judge looked through the papers, his face unreadable. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then, finally he spoke. After reviewing the facts, I find that the removal order should be dismissed. Maya is granted the right to remain in the United States. For a moment, Maya didn't move, didn't breathe. She wasn't sure she had heard correctly. Then, the room erupted. Cheers, claps. Jordan ran to her, throwing his arms around her, and Maya finally let out the breath she had been holding for what felt like years. Tears streamed down her face as relief washed over her. She had won. It wasn't just about staying. It was about proving that she belonged, that she wasn't invisible, that she wasn't just a name on a piece of paper, easily erased. She had fought for herself, for her children, for every person who had ever been told they didn't have a place here. And in the end, she had made them listen. As she stepped outside the courthouse, the cold air filling her lungs, she felt lighter than she had in years. People gathered around her, congratulating her, hugging her, celebrating this victory. It wasn't just her victory. It was a victory for so many others, still fighting their own battles. Maya knew that the fight wasn't over for everyone, that the system was still broken, that there were still countless others facing the same fears she had faced. But today, she had won, and that meant something. As she looked at her children, at the future that had been restored to her, she made a promise to never stop fighting, not just for herself, but for those still waiting, still hoping, still refusing to be silenced. Because in the end, no one should have to beg for the right to call a place home. And Maya had just proved that sometimes, against all odds, justice can prevail.